I am an occupational therapist. I'll just start again. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Zara. I'm an occupational therapist and I have an undergrad in psychology. And today we're going to be talking about courageous conversations. We're going to be talking about communication and how we can communicate better through boundary setting, through being more assertive. And the main focus that we're going to be, the main premise that we're going to be using today to create that better sense of assertiveness within us is something called nonviolent communication. So we're going to get into that and what it means and how to use that to be more assertive. So first of all, what is nonviolent communication? So nonviolent communication, it's a funny name, right? Like it implies that our communication is inherently violent. So it's an interesting name, but basically what it means is it's deemed this language of life. So what nonviolent communication is basically trying to do is help us release patterns of defensiveness and aggressiveness and increase our sense of compassion and empathy to improve the quality of our relationships. So when we can talk to people in this way, when we can communicate in a different way, then we can often make our relationships that much better. And we all know that better relationships really support us in our lives and how we can, when we're feeling supported and we're feeling connected, that makes a huge difference in terms of how we're feeling overall. So using this can improve our lives in a lot of different ways. Now, it also helps us to learn about ourselves and learn more about our relationships and maintain focus on the present. So there's a lot of goals with nonviolent communication. And what we're learning is to be more assertive. So there's different kinds of communication styles, right? Like you've probably heard of the communication style of being aggressive. So when somebody's really aggressive, they might be blaming and criticizing and judging and name calling and things like that. That's kind of goes under the aggressive category of communication. I'm sure everybody knows somebody who communicates like that. Maybe you communicate like that. It's a common form of communication. We also have passive aggression style of communication where people are saying something rude, but in a sort of more passive way. So, making snide comments and slipping in sort of backhanded compliments and things like that. That's the passive aggressive. And then we have passive people who are just like more in that people-pleasing response of saying, whatever you want, and I don't have any needs, and my needs don't matter, and, that kind of communication. All three of those aren't going to be super effective, right? So if we're being really aggressive, people are probably going to be defensive. And if we're being passive aggressive, again, that can be hurtful or people can be defensive. And if we're being passive, we're not getting our needs met. The bottom line is that if we're not being assertive, which is communicating our needs and our boundaries in a compassionate way, then we're never going to get our needs met. And of course, getting your needs met is a huge part of having that beautiful part of the human experience, which is relationships, right? So today we're going to lay out a bit of a groundwork with using this nonviolent communication model so that you can feel like you can communicate more assertively. And so we're going to talk for about an hour about this, and then we'll have an opportunity to ask questions for about half an hour. Now, when we're listening to somebody, when we're in a conversation, we're not really trying to listen with the intent to respond. This is one of the first things that we really want to think about. We want to listen with the intent to understand. So, it's easy when you're in a conversation to think, okay, this is what I'm going to say next, and this is how I'm going to formulate it in my head. And especially if you're dealing with, brain fog and cognitive problems and stuff like that from dealing with long-term conditions, it can be difficult to, fully listen and be present and try to understand, because we want to remember what we wanted to say as well. But what we want to try to do is build our capacity to really listen and be present in the conversation with the intent to understand what that person is saying and to get to know them better and to understand their perspective, rather than just kind of jumping into, this is my perspective, and it's good to have a balance between the two things. So empathy is the foundation of nonviolent communication. So when we think about how to communicate assertively, we need to be able to have empathy for the other person and for ourselves. Empathy is this universal human need to be understood. We can think of it as respectful or compassionate understanding, sort of being present with that intention to understand. It's really like sympathy, as we'll talk about in a minute. Sympathy is more like having pity for somebody, feeling sorry for them, whereas empathy is really understanding what somebody else is going through. Even if we haven't been through that, even if we don't necessarily agree with what they're doing or how they're handling a situation, we can still be empathetic to the fact that they are going through something. We can take it a step further by being compassionate. So compassionate is empathy with action. So when we are compassionate, that means that not only are we understanding what somebody else is going through or helping somebody else understand what we're going through, but we're also taking some kind of action to help support that person. Now, that doesn't mean that we're fixing the problem, but it could mean that we are just being present. We are, offering something that the person might need. We are being there with that person in their suffering. That's how we can take empathy to that next level. So empathy is really the foundation of nonviolent communication. If you can think of some instances in your life where you've been in conflict with somebody, the first thing to go out the window is empathy, right? If we are starting to get mad at somebody, we have way less empathy for them. If you think about something like, you're driving in your car and somebody cuts you off, and the first thing is, oh, they're a jerk, oh, they're rude, whatever, right? That sort of, we jump to that non-compassionate lens. But if we have a bit of empathy, if we think, maybe there's an emergency, maybe that person is really needed to get to the hospital or something like that. Like maybe there's something going on that caused that person to do that. Instead of assuming the worst right away, we can understand how that might change our perspective and help us to become more empathetic to the situation. Even if that's not the truth, it's better to think about the whole picture, like this could be an option, rather than to just assume the worst right away. So we can see how empathy is really the foundation of being assertive and communicating well and understanding what other people are going through and what we're going through, because when we can empathize, then we can really understand. And misunderstandings are the root of all conflict, right? When we misunderstand something, when we disagree about something, that's sort of the root of conflict. Now, this can get a little bit confusing because a lot of people think about empathy and they think about compassion, and they have some mixed up ideas about what it really means. So why don't we break it down a little bit further, what it means to have empathy and compassion, what it doesn't mean. So what empathy and compassion is not, it's not sympathy. So empathy and sympathy are different. Sympathy is more like pity. It's more like, yeah, I've been there, I understand. Or it's like I feel sorry for you. That's the sympathy. Empathy is a step further, where it's like, yes, I really understand what you're going through. Like I feel the feelings that you're feeling, not necessarily that you're taking it on, but that you really understand. Even if you haven't been through it before, you can kind of put yourself in their shoes and imagine what it's like. And again, compassion is even that further step where we're saying, now I'm going to do something to alleviate your suffering. And then that doesn't mean you're taking it away completely, but it means that you might be present with them. You might offer them something they need, et cetera, et cetera. So compassion is that extra step. It's not suggestions. Now, I hear my friends and clients complain about this a lot, that, someone's venting to someone else, and then someone will give them a suggestion. Oh, let me tell you what I think you should do, right? Because I work in healthcare and literally spend 8 hours of my day every day giving people suggestions, it's hard sometimes to remember that that's not always what people need, right? People need empathy and support and presence. And it's really helpful, a super helpful tip for communicating with somebody who's in distress is to ask them if they want advice, right? So before giving advice, before just saying, this is what you should do, have you tried this? Have you done this? You know, as well as anyone in this world knows, that if you are expressing hurt or you're expressing suffering, and the first thing that someone does is, you should do this, right? We call it shoulding on you. In psychology, it's our little joke that we have. If someone starts shoulding on you, you should do this, you should do that. That is never really well received, right? So something we can say is, hey, I have an idea about what you could do. Do you want to hear it? Right? So we could ask first. And if you find that other people should on you a lot, then you can ask them to do the same for you, right? So before giving you advice, before telling you you should do something, you could ask them, hey, before you give me advice, can you just ask if I want that advice in that moment, right? So we can ask for that suggestions thing before, right? It's the same with fixing or resolving, oh, toddler's crying because of the broken toy. Oh, I'll just get you a new one right away, right? We're kind of going in and just fixing it right away. This happens again a lot in relationships where we just need empathy and somebody says, we'll make it better. We'll just fix it right now. There's a time and a place for fixing, right? But there's also a time and a place for empathy. So we have to understand which one we're going to use. Now, again, it's not investigation either. When was the first time you felt this way? Why do you think you feel this way? What's going on? There's a time and a place where that's really useful. And it can be super useful, especially in a therapeutic context, right? So when was the first time you felt this way? Could be useful when you're with your therapist, or if you're exploring something deeper with a friend, or that's where you want to go. But we just want to not confuse that with empathy, because empathy, again, is more so like that sounds really hard. Like that must be a very difficult experience for you. Tell me about how you're feeling, like it's more of that exploratory, what's happening, how are you feeling? Let me sit with you and let me just kind of be with you in this hard moment. It's also not diagnosing. This is something that happens a lot with people, oh, it's because you're this, it's because you're that, it's because you're selfish, it's because this and that, whatever, we don't want to start diagnosing people. And that's never going to be super helpful. That's not empathy. Also, it's not agreement. We don't necessarily have to agree with somebody. Feelings are always valid. That's important to understand. Feelings are always valid. Behaviors are not necessarily, right? So someone could do something awful because they felt angry. That anger was valid. It makes sense. It's okay to be angry. It's maybe not okay to hit someone or yell at someone if you're angry, right? So we can validate somebody's experience and emotions without validating their behaviors. And the same for yourself, right? If you're in a sort of spiral of doing certain behaviors that you don't want to be doing with other people, you can validate that you felt anxious or you felt angry or you felt sad, and that's why you did something, but not necessarily validate that behavior and think about, okay, well, what would be a more constructive way to deal with those feelings than this behavior that I don't want to do anymore? So we can really think about these concepts in relationship to ourselves and in relationship to other people. Now, some things to remember. You're not responsible for other people's feelings, ever. That's not your responsibility. Even if you're a parent or caregiver or partner, you're not responsible for their feelings. You can be present, you can be caring without trying to take responsibility or have to resolve the other person's emotional discomfort. So that's really important to understand, is that we can't always fix it. We can't always make somebody feel not sad. We can't always make somebody feel not angry. That's not the goal of communicating well. The goal of communicating well is to help somebody else understand that you're there, that you're present, or whatever it is, whatever the situation you guys have. The goal is to communicate your needs, not necessarily to change something, fix something, or even have your needs met by the other person. It's just to communicate well. So we can't basically like rescue others, and others can't rescue us. We have to be responsible for our own feelings, but that support and that empathy can really help, right? That's amazing. We can be present. We can have curiosity. We can have care. And again, if you want to sort of flip this around, if you feel like people aren't treating you in this way, these are really good words and ways of understanding so that you can request these kinds of things. We're going to be getting into requests in terms of communication. And you can think about, okay, well, maybe I need more curiosity and care and empathy rather than fixing and diagnosing and, that kind of thing. So that's something that you might want to request in your relationships. And again, we talked about this validation thing, right? You can validate someone's feelings without validating their behavior. Now, this is from the Nonviolent Communication Manual. It's from the Nonviolent Communication book by Michael Rosenberg. And he talks about these habits of disconnecting. So these logical habits of disconnecting, and then these antidotes to reconnect, to connect two people together, to have that nonviolent communication, to have that assertive communication. We talked in the beginning, it's called courageous conversations. Courageous, the first part of courageous means heart, right? So from the heart. To be courageous means that you are heartfelt. And so when we do things from our heart, when we do things from that love and that compassion, that empathy, then we can get a lot more done. So some of the things that can really cause disconnection is, again, this diagnosis, this judging, criticizing, blaming, these kinds of things. You're so antisocial, you're so lazy, you're so whatever, insert judgment, right? Those things can really start to cause disconnection. Denial of responsibility. So I had to sit there and listen to everyone's opinion and it sucked, right? The antidote to the denial of responsibility is an acknowledgement of choice. So I chose to stay in the room and listen to everyone's opinion because I was scared that if I left, they would think less of me. One example that I read a long time ago that helps me to this day is this denial of responsibility so an example is, I have to do the dishes and I hate doing the dishes, right? So denial of responsibility. Denial of choice. I have to is a denial of choice. The acknowledgement of choice is, I want to do the dishes because I want to have a clean house and I want to make my roommates happy. You know what I mean? So it's a shift in perspective that can help us to come at things more from the heart, right? So the antidote to diagnosis, sorry, I missed this one earlier. So the antidote to judging, criticizing, blaming is reporting on our inner world. So we're going to talk about this formula a little bit deeper, but in this book, he says, I noticed that when you say no to having dinner with me, I feel sad because I value our connection and want to get to know you better. So this is, instead of saying, you're so flaky, this is the 5th time you've said no to dinner in the last month, instead of diagnosing, you're so flaky, you're so antisocial, how dare you not want to go to dinner with me, that judging, criticizing, blaming, we're reporting on what's happening for us, right? It's really important in communication, and especially in assertive communication, to really report on what's happening in our inner world. That's what really matters, is what is happening inside for us, because we really can't comment on what's happening for someone else. And that usually makes them defensive, right? So saying, I feel sad not you make me sad, but I feel sad because I value our connection and I would love to get to know you better. I would love to go to dinner with you, right? So that's how we can kind of have an antidote for that. A demand. So a demand, when we demand something from someone else, this is a way of disconnecting, because a demand implies threat or punishment, right? If you don't take responsibility for your actions, I'm leaving, right? Threat or punishment. Whereas a request is, would you be willing to acknowledge the impact of your not calling me when you said you would, right? That would help me build trust and help me stay in this conversation. So it's a request, it's a question. Would you be willing to? And it's also explaining how them doing that would help you feel better, right? Because sometimes people don't understand why you need that. So it's helpful to understand, and we're going to talk a lot more about requests. Deserve versus a desire, right? So this deserving attitude can be very disconnecting as well. So linking behavior with punishment and reward. I deserve to be heard. I deserve to be listened to. It's, or like a complaint even, like, I'm so mad at you for not listening to me. It's much better to express a desire or a want than to express a complaint. So you never do the dishes versus, I would really love it if you could do the dishes 2 times a week, because, I do the dishes 2 times a week as well, and that would make it even, and I value us having a clean house. It's the difference between expressing that complaint and this sort of disconnecting happening versus connecting this desire or want. This is what I want. And again, we're going to talk more about how to make those requests. But these are kind of some of the things that can start to disconnect us. And these are some of the things that can bring us back into connection. Now, when we're talking about nonviolent communication, there's 4 components. So there's sentence stems, and we're gonna break each one down, and we're gonna talk about how to do each one of them in turn, because I would love for you guys to have this as something that you could use today. If you wanted to go out and try it today, you could use it. So the first is observations. We're gonna talk a lot about what that means. Then feelings, then needs, and then requests. So let's get into it. What does all this mean? The structure, so the observation. So this could be when you're observing somebody doing something that's upsetting to you, right? This side. This other side is when you've done something that has upset somebody else, and it's evident that they're upset. So the sentence structure is, when you, this is the observation, I feel, this is the feelings, because this is the needs, would you be willing to, this is the request. And the same thing for these ones, but this is to do if you've done something to hurt somebody else. So an example would be, and again, we're going to get into each of these and make it very clear what they mean. So this is just kind of your 10,000-foot overview before we go into each one. And then hopefully at the end, you'll have to be very comfortable in how to use this structure. So this is the observation. So when you come home late, it's an observation of a behavior. I feel anxious. So when you come home late without texting me, let's say, I feel anxious because I value your safety. Would you be willing to text me if you're going to be home late? Right? So that's basically how we would structure something. Somebody has done something and you felt a certain way about it, and you're expressing how you feel, you're expressing your needs, you're expressing your values, and you're requesting for something about the behavior to change. When you yell at me, I feel scared because I have been in situations before where I didn't feel safe when someone was yelling at me. Would you be willing to talk to me in a quieter voice? Right? So that's sort of the structure of it. And then for this is, if you notice you've done something that the person didn't like, then you can kind of use this the other way, right? We're just kind of reversing it. So it's like, when I came home late without texting you, is it true that you felt a little bit anxious? You know, if somebody's like closing off, shutting down, you can kind of ask them, like, is it true that you felt anxious, or maybe you felt a bit angry? You're kind of checking in with them to see what they felt, because you wanted to know that I was safe. Would you like me to text you before I come home? So you're anticipating their needs a little bit, or you're asking them, what would you like me to do to remedy this situation? So you can see how this structure can work both ways. If you feel a really strong emotional reaction, you have to attend to your needs first, right? So if somebody is clearly upset with you, and like they're angry with you, they're anxious, they're sad, they're crying, whatever it is, and you want to use that technique where you're like, okay, well, when I said, that I don't trust you anymore, it sounded like you were really sad. We're not going to launch into that necessarily, unless we feel like we're a little bit more centered in ourselves. So if you notice somebody's really sad and you feel a very strong emotional reaction, try to attend to your needs first. See if you can go, take a deep breath, just make it clear that you need to attend to your needs. And then you can try to feel into what the other person is feeling and needing, because we're not going to do a very good job of anticipating other people's needs and reacting in a non-reactive, non-violent way if we are, just kind of jumping into this when we're outside of our window of tolerance. If you have skills that you use, like breathing techniques or, listening techniques to soothe your nervous system, this is a really good time to use them so that you can then try to assess somebody else's needs. So you have to decide whether you're going to attend to their feelings and needs first or yours. Hopefully both will be attended to, but you kind of have to decide what you're going to do. So we've been talking for about half an hour, and I understand that a lot of people on this call might have, difficulty paying attention for a long period of time, or, technology just feels a little overwhelming. So why don't we take 3 deep breaths together? So you can close your eyes if that's comfortable, and we'll just take a couple deep breaths to give ourselves a little break and reset. Excellent. Awesome. So we'll keep going here. So yeah, let's get into observations first. So this is the when you part of that sentence stem. So you're clearly expressing what you're observing in yourself or someone else. So it's a behavior, and this behavior has basically not contributed to your well-being. So this behavior has in some way brought something up inside of you that is unpleasant. Now, we're not blaming, we're not criticizing, and we're not judging in this, and we're going to get into that a little bit more about what we're not doing. What we are doing is saying something that's clearly a behavioral observation, or a like a statement that they said, right? And it has to be exactly what was said. So if you're unclear, you could say, when you said something along the lines of this, this, and this is how I interpret it, this is how I feel, you know what I mean? So observations, you have to be as close to what happened as possible. And it's a behavior, right? So if you were a detective, this is something that you could say in court, right? You could write this down. It could be verifiable. It is true. It happened. It's an observation. When you came home at 9 instead of 7, when you left the house with a sink full of dishes, right? When you said this, this, and this, right? So it's when you, and then you state the observation. And again, it has to be something that you could see, like you could observe in another person when you made that face, when you threw a piece of garbage on the ground. You're saying exactly what happened without any fillers, without any judgment, without any like making it bigger than it is. So this is really important that we get each of these steps right, because if we mess up one of them, then we're not speaking non-violently and we're not communicating assertively. So some of the ways that this goes wrong, some common difficulties with the observation, is when we judge someone. So we're not saying something that's a judgment. So for example, you're not saying, when you're mean to me, right? When you ask me stupid questions, we're not saying like, when you are a jerk, when you are unloving, when you are, insert with whatever it is that you can think of. You might even be able to think of something in the last week that you said to somebody that's similar to this, right? Like, we're not implying a judgment or a criticism or something that isn't true or real or didn't actually just happen. And of course, to you, it could be very true that you felt like they were just being mean to you. So you might want to say, when you were mean to me, or, when you told me, or, something like this, when you asked me a stupid question. You might feel like that's really true to you, but is it like 100% a fact that could be presented in a court of law? Is it something you could catch on a camera? Like something that they said, something that they did, right? Is it, not that I want you to go and capture mean things people are doing to you on camera. Don't do that. But could it be, right? Is it that observable? Because them being mean to you is, while it's true to you, that's still an observation that you're making that's not necessarily a fact. So we want to keep it to the facts. When you come home at 9 instead of 7, right? When you text me, hey, instead of, the typical, I love you, I'll see you later, right? So it's something that you've seen for sure. Then our feelings. So when I feel, this is the next part of the sentence stem. I feel sad, I feel angry, I feel upset, I feel frustrated, etc., right? Or again, if we're switching it around, if somebody's upset with us, and we could ask them how they might feel, like, or assess, maybe you feel mad, do you feel sad? You're asking them how they feel so that they can clarify for you what their feeling is. Now, this one is where it goes wrong a lot of the time. People try to express how they feel and they say, you make me feel, right? Imagine how activating that is for most people to hear, you make me feel angry. That's activating, right? That's going to put someone on the defense. You have to understand that it's not you make me feel, it's that when this behavior happens, I feel, right? It's a subtle difference and it seems like semantics and, like it shouldn't matter. But think about that. If I was talking to you right now directly and I said, you made me really angry, versus I said, when you said X, Y, and Z, I felt angry. Do you notice the difference? Of course, there's a bit of a difference in my tone, but do you notice the difference in how you would interpret that statement? Because that's really important. It's not that they made you feel a certain way, because no one can really make you feel a certain way. It's that when that behavior happened, you ended up feeling a certain way. That's how you interpreted that behavior and you felt that way. So that can be a really important distinction to make. It's when I feel, not you make me feel. Some common difficulties with this is that people often will state something that's not a feeling. I feel like you're rude, right? That's not a feeling. You're, again, making a judgment or criticism. I feel stupid. Stupid is not a feeling. I feel uncared for. Again, that's not a feeling, right? So if we say, I feel uncared for, again, that's going to trigger somebody into thinking like, oh my gosh, this person doesn't think I'm caring and all the things I do for them. And it's just going to launch them into defense, right? So you don't want to say, I feel misunderstood. I feel uncared for. I feel like you don't love me, whatever. I don't know. I'm just trying to make things up as we go along. But you really actually want to say a feeling. And if you're uncertain what constitutes as a feeling, there are many good lists online. You could look up feeling lists. Again, a lot of these screenshots are from this Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life by Michael Rosenberg. So these are some feelings mentioned in the book. I feel frustrated. I feel jealous. I feel reluctant. I feel uneasy. I feel surprised, right? I feel alarmed. I feel brokenhearted. These are things that we can express that are actually feelings rather than I feel like you don't care. I feel like, I failed as a person, whatever, right? Those aren't feelings. We want to talk about how we actually feel. And there's this concept in psychology called emotional granularity. What that means is that the closer you can get, the granularity, the closer that you can get to the actual feeling that you feel, the more control you have over your feelings. Maybe control isn't the best word. The more you can sort of befriend your feelings and understand them deeper and then work with them. So if you're able to really identify what you feel, then that can really put you 10 steps forward with communication, but also with understanding yourself. So what I recommend to a lot of my clients is to Google a feeling wheel. There's lots of them, and you can choose the one that's prettiest. I have them printed out on my cushions in my therapy room. So you can print out a therapy wheel and put it on your fridge and notice if you can, throughout the day, whenever you pass your fridge, check in with what you're feeling, because this can really help you in this communication, right? So I feel because this is our needs. We're describing our needs or our values. This is kind of the reason behind the feeling, right? So why do I feel this way? Well, because I have a need for connection, or because I have a need for safety, or I have a need for cleanliness, right? I value cleanliness in the house, right? So what values or needs are aligned with the feelings and the behavior? How is it all connected? This one is you're really bringing everything together and connecting it, making it make sense, right? So you're describing what your need or value is. And again, if you're confused about needs, there is a great needs list in this book. There's also really, if you just search like needs and values online, there's many worksheets where you could look at your needs and values. So I have a need for harmony. I have a need for empathy. I have a need for safety, right? I have a need for appreciation. We want to make sure that if we're saying, that you have a need for empathy, that again, we're not going that extra step in criticizing someone, saying they're not empathetic, just that maybe that one behavior or that one statement that upset you wasn't empathetic, right? So yeah, we can kind of look at our needs and then decide what we want to say, again, without being criticizing or judgmental. So it's also really helpful to take a look at a list of your needs and values and just get to know yourself better. Part of being able to communicate is to know yourself so that you can communicate what it is that you're experiencing and what it is that you need. So we can think about that. A request. Now, this is the part that gets missed most. Most often, people will say, I feel, because, and then they'll not ask for something. It's gonna be a particular problem for people pleasers and for people who have a hard time asking for what they need. But please make sure that when you use this formula that you don't miss the request, because if we miss the request, then someone's going to be very confused about what they should do, right? If we just say, when you do this behavior, I feel this way, someone's going to be like, okay, well, I guess I could not do that behavior again, but I want to. And, like it could become very confusing. And we have to understand that it's really helpful to give someone a bit of a roadmap about what we need. So it's a clear request too. And again, a clear request means that we're not saying like, I need you to be more loving, right? Because that's not very clear. If I say I need you to be more loving, what does that mean, right? That could mean 15 different things to 15 different people. So we have to be very clear and specific about what we would like them to do, right? Would you be willing to? Again, this is not a demand. And we're going to talk in a little bit about boundaries. This is not a demand. A boundary is a little bit more firm. This is just a request. Would you be willing to? Or again, if we're investigating someone being upset with us, would you like me to? Right? Now, it's also important to keep in mind that requests might not be met, right? People can and will sometimes say no. So the purpose of making a request is not to get somebody to say yes. That is not the purpose of the request. Sometimes you have to compromise, and sometimes you have to work through, would you be willing to text me before you get home? No, I can't because I'm driving and I don't want to text and drive. Okay, how can we work this out? Like, what would help me to feel more safe in this situation, right? What would facilitate that need that I just said being met for both of us, right? So you can have that sort of that conversation about how to navigate that situation to make it easier. So yeah, someone's not always going to say yes, and don't anticipate that. I feel like when I first started to learn about this, I was like, this is great. I'm going to just go out there in the world and people are going to listen and people are going to respond to my needs. And that's not how it works. So make sure that you have that understanding going into it, that it might not always work the way you want it to, but at least you communicated clearly, right? So some examples of requests might be like, for that coming home late example, would you be willing to text me before you come home? For the dishes example, would you be willing to do the dishes this many times in a week? Would you be willing to talk to me in a quiet voice rather than a loud voice? Would you be willing to revisit this conversation when, we're not so heated? Would you be willing to not use that kind of language with me because I find it triggering? Would you be willing to not say this, and this around me? So there's many different ways in which we can ask for something. And this is why, again, I suggest making a list of your needs and values, because then you can get really clear on the things that are important to you and the things that you might want to ask for, right? Especially if you're one of those people who's like, man, I've never asked for anything I needed in my life. Great. Well, let's get started here with a list of your needs and values so that you can understand what it is you do want. So putting it all together, right? When you, right, observation, I feel, you're feeling because I need or value, would you be willing to, right? And then, or if somebody else is, experiencing upset with you, when you hear or see, do you feel this way because you need this? Would you like, right? So we're investigating for them, helping them. This can be really helpful, especially for kids when they're having a hard time expressing themselves. Now, yeah, another thing to keep in mind is that this is a framework. And in the beginning of using this, you might sound a little bit like a robot, right? And I remember when I first started this with my partner, they were like, I can't believe you're about to use that nonviolent communication crap on me. Like they could hear me go into it, because I'm like, when you, and they're like, then they get mad because, it just feels formulaic and it feels robotic. Over time, you can find ways to have this same structure where you're expressing your observations, your feelings, your needs, and your requests without this exact, when you, I feel, because I, would you be willing to, like, you can find ways to express all four of those things in a way that comes across more naturally. In the beginning, if you're trying to remember it, it's helpful to have the stems, and it's helpful to, have an idea of how you want to do it. But over time, hopefully it becomes a little bit more natural and easy, and you can kind of just, put it into your conversations. Or even if you're expressing a feeling, you can kind of ask yourself, did I express that as my feeling? I feel this. Or did I express that as you make me feel? Or did I, comment on an exact observation of something? Or did I comment on something I made up in my head that that person might not necessarily be feeling or doing, or a judgment or criticism? So you could take elements of it. It doesn't have to necessarily be that robot sort of speech. Again, even if you communicate perfectly, quote unquote, perfectly, and you do this to a T, and it's beautiful, and it's, well crafted, it might not be well received, because conflict happens with people, and sometimes it's hard, and sometimes it doesn't go well. So make it your goal to communicate well, not to be received well. If you have communicated well, you've done a good job. How you're received is not necessarily going to be the outcome that we're looking for. So just think about it that way. Now let's talk a little bit more about boundaries. So a boundary is an expectation that's set in order to protect your emotional, physical, mental, or spiritual safety. So the purpose of a boundary, a lot of times people think about boundaries as like relationship enders. It's like, I'm creating an ultimatum. I'm trying to make sure that this one thing never happens again. A boundary is a little bit lighter than that. A boundary is really just setting something up so that you can continue the relationship. Ideally, a boundary is generous and saying like, I love you, or I value this relationship, if it's like a work relationship or something, and I really want to continue to have this relationship with you, but this needs to happen first, right? So it's a continuation. It's not a stopping of a relationship when we set a boundary necessarily. Sometimes it can lead to that, but that's the goal is to continue. It's a guideline that establishes how you want to be treated. It protects the balance between things like our work, our home, our time, our relationships. And it can be simple. We want to enforce boundaries with a little bit of kindness. So what that means is that, yes, it's totally fine in some scenarios to just say no, right? In some scenarios, you can say, I don't want to do that. And that is fine, because no is a complete sentence, and you're totally allowed to just not have to explain yourself, not have to enforce a boundary with kindness. That is okay in certain circumstances. In circumstances where we're setting a boundary with somebody that we want to continue a relationship with, and we value that relationship, we might want to, or it's a professional relationship, we might want to try to enforce that boundary with kindness. Like, for example, I feel honored that you invited me, but I'm not interested in attending, or I can't go this weekend, right? So we're adding that little bit of like, hey, thank you so much. I feel honored, but here's the boundary. Here's what I'm not going to do, right? Or that sounds really hard. I'm here to hold space for you, but I think this would be better managed by a professional, right? So a boundary can sound like, I can do this, but I'm not doing this. So, I can talk to you for the next 30 minutes, but I cannot talk to you for 3 hours about this. So you're establishing what you're comfortable doing and what you're not comfortable doing. I can come and get a coffee with you, but I'm not going to go out shopping with you afterwards, because, I need to protect my energy envelope, whatever it is. Thank you for thinking of me of this project. I'm currently unavailable for unpaid work, but you can find my pricing info here. So that's an example of a boundary where we say, again, what we're not available for, and then we say what we are available for. So, I can't do anything unpaid, but if you want to offer a payment for that, then here's how we can go about that, right? So sometimes it's like, here's what I can't do, and here's a way that we can compromise, or that we can move forward in a way that's going to work for both of us, right? Yeah, so we can explore boundary setting in that sort of way. So just to revisit some overall communication skills so that we can be clear on some of the things that we want to think about moving forward. One of the things is to focus on I statements. So, right, when you, I feel, right? Not you make me feel, not you did this, you did that, I. Focusing on your experience is going to be really, really helpful for reducing the amount of defensiveness that somebody else has. It can be really helpful when we're communicating to restate what you heard someone say and reflect the meaning back to them. Why? Because we often misunderstand what somebody is saying, and especially if we're triggered. We can say, okay, when you said that, I'm probably not going to be able to get back to work for a few months. I took that as you not believing in me. Can you explain to me a little bit more about what you meant by that statement? Right? So understanding and reflecting back, did you mean that I am lazy and not a good person? Because that's how, that's kind of where my mind's going, right? Or did you mean that this, and this, right? So you can kind of clarify, hey, what did you mean by that when you said that thing? What did that mean? Or, did it mean this or this? Or kind of reflect back to them. And if somebody is expressing something to you that is emotional for them, reflecting back like, oh, wow, yeah, I heard you say that your dog just died and it's complicated for you because of the family dynamics, and that's making you feel really frustrated and there's some shame. Is that right? Is that how you're feeling? Right? So kind of reflecting back shows the person that, oh, wow, they're listening to me right now, right? Again, we really want to avoid blaming and we really want to avoid generalizing. So if you find yourself saying always, never, forever, every single time, if you notice yourself saying those generalizing statements, we're probably going to push someone towards defensiveness, right? You never take out the garbage. Someone goes, I took out the garbage this time last month, blah, 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 right? And launch at you with all the times they did take out the garbage. So try not to generalize. Really, again, be objective. This week, when the garbage was due to be taken out, you didn't take it. That's as simple as that. We don't want to say you always do this. You always are late, whatever it is, because that's usually not true. Take a break if you need it. Please do this. If you find yourself overheated, take a break. Give yourself some time, because that will make all the difference in how you communicate. 1 to 24 hours is usually a good period of time. Be specific with when you can talk again. So don't just storm out, slam the door, but just say, okay, I'm getting heated and I need to take a break for the next 2 hours. I will talk to you at 6 p.m. Right? So you're being specific and you're not just leaving the person hanging, because some people can become really anxious if you leave them not talking to them. I'm just going to go for a walk around the block, and let them know what you're doing too. I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to read a book. I'm going to scroll online. So that there's some understanding about what's happening, right? It's really helpful as well when we're communicating to focus on solutions, right? So it can be easy to be like, you did this, and this, and this happened this way. This is where the request piece comes into play, and it's really important. Focus on a solution. What can we do about this? Okay, I'm hurt, you're hurt. What's the way forward? If we can start to ask questions to each other, how do we move forward with this? How do we repair this? What is the next step? Rather than getting in the weeds, right? It's so easy in fights and in conflicts to get into the weeds. If you did this and you never do this, and we're back and forth in this amalgamation of just all the things that we've ever done. But really, we just want to say, okay, how do we start to unravel this? What is the next best step? It's you versus the problem. It's both of you, us, versus the problem. It's not you versus each other. That's something that's important to remember in relationships. It should not be two people against each other, but two people against the problem. And that could make a huge difference in how things get solved. Also, it's really important to assume good intentions, right? If we are in a pattern where we're in a lot of conflict and we start to just assume the worst of somebody, then that's going to create more and more conflict. So we have to just assume that that person did not intend to harm you. And if they did, then that's okay. We can figure that out later down the road and kind of figure, okay, well, that was actually very malicious. But in the beginning, we want to say, okay, I'm just going to assume their intentions are good, and I'm going to talk to them about it as if that is true. And if we uncover that it's not true, then maybe they can apologize and whatever. But if we start from the beginning, assuming that their intentions are good, and think about the goal of the conversation and the goal of your relationship. Do you want to end that relationship? If that's the goal of the conversation, then it's going to be a different conversation than you want to continue that relationship, or you want to fix a certain problem in that relationship, right? What is the goal of your conversation, and what would the solution be? You can even write that out before you go into the conversation. This is the goal of the conversation. These are the possible solutions. These are my feelings. These are my needs. You know, you can kind of organize it for yourself, not to take in with you like a PowerPoint and point to everything during the conversation, but to just have it in your mind and have it sort of clear and laid out. Validation goes a long way. You know, if someone goes, you know, they're not using nonviolent communication and they go, I'm mad at you. If you go, well, that's not fair, you shouldn't be mad at me, that's going to make things worse. If you go, okay, I hear that you're mad. Like, that sounds really hard to be mad. I'm sorry that you're mad. You're not necessarily apologizing for, or not, maybe not I'm sorry that you're mad, but you're not going to be apologizing for what you did necessarily yet, because we don't know. We need to have more of a conversation to understand. But if you say, oh my goodness, that would be really hard to be mad like that. Like, I hear you. I hear that you're really angry. Can you tell me more about being angry? What are you angry about? Then rather than, well, you shouldn't be angry, I do this, this, and this, and, you know, kind of going immediately into the defense. If we can validate, yeah, I hear you, you're angry, you know, just kind of repeating back to them, that can be really useful for the conversation. And again, like we said earlier, expressing a desire is better than expressing a complaint. So we're going to go into questions. If you want to be able to contact me and talk about this more in depth, you can reach out zaradureno@gmail.com. I do one-on-one sessions. I also do a lot of group sessions, so you can ask for my, I do clinical hypnosis and neuro coaching. I do neurofeedback, do a lot of different things. So you can look me up on Eventbrite for those group classes, or if you want to look up on Instagram and TikTok, this is my handle, and I'd be really happy to see you guys on there. So yeah, let's open it up for questions. I'm happy to answer whatever you guys have for me. So let's look at it. Okay, someone was saying something about the video quality being fuzzy. I'm sorry about that. I think it might be, yeah, the lighting in this room. Okay, so one of the questions here is, how does this prevent us from being mistreated by people who are not communicating in good faith? It doesn't, to be perfectly honest. If we, like we kind of talked about at the end there, if we communicate perfectly, other people still might not take it well, and they, you know, still might mistreat us. That's where boundaries are really important. So for example, if we're setting a boundary, like, I will, like, when you yell at me, I feel scared because of, you know, my past with yelling. I will not have this conversation with you unless you're able to talk to me in a normal voice, right? In like a regular voice. That's a boundary that you can set. And if that person disrespects that boundary, you can end that conversation, right? You can kind of step away. I completely understand that there are circumstances in which we can't step away, and in which, you know, there's very complicated interpersonal dynamics that can be going on, but there are little boundaries that we can set within those and hope that they're respected. But yeah, unfortunately, we can be the best communicators in the world and still be mistreated. It's just a matter of when are you willing to set up stronger boundaries so that you can step away from that mistreatment, which can be hard and which can require some support. So it's really helpful to, reach out to family, friends, or a therapist that can help support you in removing yourself from a toxic situation if that's the case. Someone said, what happens if you have someone in your life who seems to lack empathy and therefore nonviolent communication is extremely challenging? Again, I think it's sort of along the same vein, right? Of you just do the best that you can with your communication. And if your communication is not received well, then you've at least done the best that you can. And if you set your boundaries and they cross your boundaries repeatedly, then you can take the action that you set in that boundary. Sometimes we're making a request, sometimes we're making a boundary, and you have to decide which one you're going to do. So what is the solution when direct, assertive, straightforward communication is interpreted as aggression and manipulation and met with defensiveness and obstruction? So one of the things that I would suggest is, now I'm not saying that you're not communicating in that way, because you very well could be. But one of the things that I would suggest is to review some of the challenges that we talked about, because sometimes, when I first was learning about this stuff, I thought that I was communicating super well. And then I reviewed some of the conflicts that I had and the conversations that I had. And I said, there were ways in which I didn't fully communicate in a nonviolent way, with maybe stating feelings that weren't actually feelings or observations that were more judgments. So I think it's worth kind of reflecting if we are truly communicating in a assertive way and nonviolent way, and with that empathy and that validation, that extra little bit of like kindness in there. And if it's still interpreted as aggression and manipulation, that's much more about that other person's interpretation than about how you're actually acting. So I wouldn't take that to heart. I would just know that you're doing the best you can with the tools that you have, and how it's received is not up to us. So this person is saying, how do you control yourself when there is a topic that you're passionate about? Example, your experience of your health and needing medical support and advocacy. I feel so emotionally charged and I get so frustrated when healthcare providers disclaim the importance of their reports and then how that'll make impact on LTD claims. The emotion is overwhelming and I can't have an effective communication because I'm so emotionally charged. Same goes for people who disclaim that you really have a significant condition and that they make you have to go into medical retirement. Yeah, so what I would say, if we're getting really overwhelmed, this sounds like it's with healthcare providers. So if you're dealing with any healthcare provider who has, empathy, and we all should, if we're in this field, we hopefully will have empathy. You can say, look, I'm feeling really overwhelmed and I need to take a minute, right? And we can take that time to breathe, to bring ourselves back into some kind of regulation, to ground yourself, feel your feet on the floor. And sometimes when we're really overwhelmed too, just being honest about that, like, this is a really hard subject for me, and you might notice that I'm feeling overwhelmed. That's because this is progressively triggering for me. And if I start crying, this is why, right? So it's okay to be overwhelmed. Those are overwhelming things, It is really hard to advocate for yourself in this healthcare system. And if you feel overwhelmed by that, that makes sense. So I would just say, like, I am overwhelmed. And you could take a moment to bring it down. But sometimes just speaking that can be useful. Yeah, so somebody was saying that their cognition is bad. So it's hard to listen and then not want to have that, like, think about what they have to say in response, right? All they can do is listen empathetically and have a hard time with that response. Yeah, and that makes sense. And I think we just have to work with what we've got, right? So that might mean that you have shorter conversations, or that you have those time boundaries around like, hey, I can chat with you for 15 minutes, because I'm sure cognition and tiredness and stuff gets worse the longer we talk, the longer we're in that position, right? So if we can say, hey, I can chat with you for the next 15 minutes, and then I might need a break, or and then we can talk tomorrow or next week or something. So setting those time-based boundaries might be helpful. And also, depending on the relationship that you have with the person, if you can explain like, hey, it's hard for me to keep track of my thoughts when you're chatting. So just note if, I'm making a funny face, or if I interrupt you, or if I seem like I'm, thinking while you're talking, that's to do with my cognition. So you can kind of self-disclose to your comfort level. Someone was asking the author for the nonviolent communication book. His name is Michael Rosenberg. And if you look up nonviolent communication, he'll be the first person to come up, because he's like the father of it. So this person was asking, how can these things help when we're trying to communicate our needs with people who hold institutional power over us and our well-being? Again, I think a little bit of this structure and a little bit of validation and empathy can go a long way with any human. So whether you're talking to an insurance agency, or you're talking to a doctor, or whoever holds power over your well-being, as you're saying, this structure can sometimes help us to communicate what it is that we need to communicate, because it can be really overwhelming to try and figure out how to communicate our needs, or if we want to be talked to in a certain way, or if a certain communication is working for us or not. And you totally are well within your rights to request to be spoken to in a certain way, or communicated with on a certain frequency by your insurance claims even. So you do have more power in that situation than a lot of people feel like they do. So that's something to consider. I'm just reading another one here. So someone is asking a question about communication challenges, where people assume when you have, ME or chronic illnesses, that if you're taking a long time to respond, or not being able to meet up, that you're sad, or that you're angry with them or something. So they're kind of misunderstanding your emotional experience. So yeah, when we're using nonviolent communication, because it says, in this question, even if they're using something close to nonviolent communication, when we're using nonviolent communication, we're not telling someone they feel a certain way. So we're not like, you're sad. We're like, oh, are you upset right now? And you can say no, right? So if somebody is asking you like, are you sad? You can say, no, I'm not sad. And then if that becomes a habit, and you're bothered by the fact that this person continuously asks you if you're sad when you're not talking, you can say, hey, you can use this formula back to them. You can say, hey, when you ask me, 3 times in a week, if I'm sad when I'm being quiet, it makes me feel frustrated, because I value, understanding of my illness. And just to help you understand a little bit about my illness, sometimes I get really quiet, or, introspective, or need a bit more time to respond, or can't go out. And that's really just because of my illness. It's not because I'm sad. So would you be willing to, ask me a different question, or, allow me to tell you if I'm sad, rather than asking me if I am. So you could kind of formulate your own question around that, if that makes sense. Someone asked for a recommendation about a book. So anything by Michael Rosenberg. If you type nonviolent communication, there's a ton of workbooks and regular books. There's a lot of information on it. And then if you look up assertiveness, there's a lot of information and worksheets and stuff about that too. So someone was saying, what should I say when my partner has a habit of getting defensive when I try to talk about anything having to do with our relationship, including requesting help or expressing my needs? Again, all we can really do is use this to the best of our ability, make sure that you're not having any of those difficulties with each step that a lot of people have. Make sure you're actually making like clear requests that don't include judgments. And if they're still getting defensive all the time, then it might be useful to chat with, a counselor who can kind of mitigate the two of you rather than trying to do it on your own. So somebody was saying, how can I deal with bullies who trigger their PTSD? So again, if you're triggered, it's really helpful to do things to get you back down into regulation. It's hard to comment on how to deal with bullies because bullies can act in so many different ways, right? Like online or in person, they could say a lot of different things. They could physically act. So it really depends on kind of what they're doing and how they're doing it. And we might want to use a more formal version of nonviolent communication. And depending on the situation and how that bullying is happening, you might want to, ignore the situation or get external help for the situation, depending on how serious it is and sort of where those people are. So there's a lot of different considerations for that question. So I feel like in a group setting, it's harder to answer something like that. Just reading another one here. So this person is saying, like, how do you start to make a safe space to have this conversation when you don't necessarily see someone all the time, and when you do see them, you don't want to launch into, I feel next time kind of out of the blue. They say they just kind of stepped back from the group chats after a few years of built up trauma. So yeah, I mean, I guess I would ask yourself the goals of the relationship, right? Because if somebody has neglected you when you asked for help, then it's worth reflecting if you want to be their friend at all, right? If that's a relationship that you want to continue and to pursue. And if it is, then it would be worthwhile to ask yourself, if this is like a relationship I really value and I don't feel safe to bring up my needs, then again, like how can we go about this where I can feel comfortable bringing up my needs in the future? Because to me, if I hear someone say like, my friend neglected me when I reached out for help, and I don't even feel comfortable telling them my needs, that might be a harder relationship to continue, right? There's lots of reasons why we continue relationships, and I don't think that we should just cut everyone out. And I think we should give people a chance. I think you'd be surprised how well received it can be sometimes when we give people a chance to actually listen to our needs. So I would try to express your needs, and if they're not met well, that might not be a person that you want to continue a relationship with, depending on the dynamics of your relationship and how that works. So what do we do if we need to step away from a conversation that's being heated or making us feel bad about yourselves? Or bringing up horrible memories, you can't remember trivial details and things like that. So if you need to step away, I think it's as easy as saying, hey, I'm feeling heated, I'm feeling activated, and I need to take a break right now. And saying, I'm going to come back, but right now I need a break. So I will come back in X amount of time, and we can revisit this. And using that time to actually take a break. Earlier I said you might go and scroll on the computer or whatever, but try to actually use that time to do something that's regulating for your nervous system, because that can really help you come back to the conversation. And you can think during that break too about, okay, am I doing this nonviolent thing in a good way? Are each of these statements actually my feelings, actually observations? Am I being empathetic? Am I validating that other person's experience? Am I validating my own experience? So in that break, you can kind of take some time to reflect. this talk will be on the METV YouTube videos. Yes. Somebody asked that. So somebody was saying that when I tell people I'm doing something like going to a concert or on a trip, they automatically say, that's so great, you're feeling better. So I'm assuming this person probably has long COVID or ME/CFS or something like that, as most of you do in this group. And that makes them angry. And then they're saying, I'm not doing something because I need something, because I'm feeling better. I'm doing it because I need some fun in my life. And it might make me feel lousy the next day. And then they say that when they explain that, then they look offended, and how to communicate that in a way that helps them understand. And it doesn't feel like the sort of situation for NVC. So it's funny that you say it doesn't feel like the sort of situation for NVC, because you kind of structured this question in an NVC way. And I think it'd be useful to structure that to someone else in an NVC way as well. So again, it doesn't have to feel super formulaic, but in the formulaic way, you could say, when you say that I am feeling better because I'm going to a concert, I feel frustrated because I have a need for people to understand me and understand my condition. And I'm not doing this because I feel better. I'm doing it because I want to have some fun, and I'm probably going to feel really crappy the next day. So, would you be willing to not make comments like that in the future that I'm doing better? Like I can tell you if I'm starting to do better, and we can celebrate that then together. That might be, they might be received with like a, whoa, I didn't realize, like, I'm sorry, or kind of like a defensiveness, but it's still you expressing your needs, and that's good. That's a good thing to do. Yeah, so someone's asking for a Dropbox link to the slides. I will send them to Bruno, and Bruno will send them out. Someone's asking, what kind of group sessions and classes do I give? All kinds. So there's 3 different courses through Dr. Arsenault that you could sign up for if you're one of his patients. So I do a chronic pain course, a nervous system regulation course, and a mind-body course. And then I do clinical hypnotherapy group sessions once every 2 weeks, and those are on many different topics. Then the one that I'm doing next week is on managing chronic illness. And you can find those on Eventbrite. Okay, so someone has a great question about non-verbal communication while we're within these interactions. So yeah, it's really important that we don't have a dissonance between what we're saying and how our face is looking, right? Because if you're saying like, I love you, but your face is completely blank, it's not going to come across as you love them. So we do want to try, and as much as we can, match our facial expressions to what we're saying, match our body posture. So some of the things that we can think about is, am I leaning in, or am I leaning away? Are my arms crossed, or am I open? Is there a smile on my face? Am I, are my eyebrows, I call it eyebrows kissing, are my eyebrows coming together or not? Am I furrowing my brows, and is my jaw clenched? See if you can check in with your own body before, during the conversation, and see if you can kind of relax into what you're feeling. And if you notice a different bodily sensation, we talk about this in the mind body course. If you notice that a different bodily sensation is coming up as opposed to what you're saying, we might need to start to change what we're saying, right? We might need to, if you're saying, oh, I completely understand and I'm not mad at you, but your jaw is tense and your shoulders are coming up to your ears and you're like leaning back, you could be like, kind of checking in with yourself. Maybe there is a bit of anger. Okay, what is that anger about? Like, why is that anger there? And kind of reflecting on that within yourself, that can help to change the situation. You can also let someone know if you're really tired, like, hey, I'm really tired. I want to have this conversation with you right now. I'm really tired. So if my face looks tired, it's not because of this conversation. It's because going into this conversation, I'm tired, right? So we can also give a little bit of disclaimer. So what to do when a person doesn't respect a boundary or need but our family? I think it really depends on the severity of the boundary or the need, right? If it is something that is significantly impacting your life every single day and you feel like you are miserable because that boundary isn't being respected, sometimes we need to take a step back from even from family members, right? And I do not advocate cutting out family members just for the fun of it. And of course, within different cultures, there's different connections and family systems, and there's lots of things to consider. And I really don't recommend that. It's a very hard step to make. Some people have to do it, right? Some people have very abusive relationships with their family members and they have to take a step back. We could also put a little bit more distance between us in terms of the frequency of calls, the frequency of visits, how much time we spend together, that kind of thing. Or again, just kind of seeing if how you're communicating it is actually getting across properly. And if there's any way that you guys can reach some sort of compromise so that that boundary or need could be respected. Because there might be, like if you're saying, would you be willing to do this? And they're not willing to do that, then maybe there's like, this or this that could happen instead. So there's a couple different levels of how you could approach a situation where a boundary isn't respected, but their family. How do you converse with passive aggressive people who turn things back on you? Again, I would just try to stay objective. I would try to stay within the realms of this sort of framework. And it's harder to continue to throw things back at you, turn things back at you, be passive aggressive when you're using this. It's not impossible. It certainly has been done before, but it's harder. Someone said, how does double empathy weigh in here? I'm not sure. I haven't heard that term before. So someone said, what do you say when a child is having emotional outburst or temper tantrum? So children are a lot different than adults, right? So we're going to talk to a child a lot different than we might talk to an adult, depending on the child's age and their developmental stage. And, if they're neurotypical or neurodiverse, we're going to talk to a child differently. But it is useful to kind of use some of that same language, like when you can't go to the pool today to go for a swim, you sound really frustrated because you really like going to the pool. Do you want to go to the pool on the weekend instead? Like, you could use some form of that communication, and still it's really helpful again to help children develop that emotional granularity at a young age. So having that emotions wheel or the feelings wheel or the needs chart, and even having them like a little magnet on the fridge where they put the magnet on which feeling they're feeling that day can be really helpful to help them develop that sense of emotional granularity, where they can then tell you, I'm feeling frustrated. And you can say, oh, honey, I'm sorry you're feeling frustrated. What do you need? And kind of support them through that. How do you approach a situation at work? Now, again, it's going to depend on the power structures, on, if it's your boss, if it's your peer, and it depends on like how frequently something's happening. In this situation, somebody was saying that they get called always tired. So it's up to you to disclose however much you want to disclose. If you, again, I'm assuming you probably have MECFS if you're on this call. So you could disclose, I have a medical condition, or you could say, like, I don't appreciate that comment. Like, would you be okay with, not saying that again? It feels like confrontational, but it's actually just really trying to help continue that conversation forward. Or like, I appreciate that you're trying to be funny, but like, to me, that's not very funny because I have a medical condition or whatever it is. And then, you could sandwich it in. So something light, your request, and then something light on the end. Or, in an email. If it's really serious, you could talk to HR. I'm just reading out this longer question. So someone was asking, would you recommend setting up rules for fighting? So they were saying they have a friend that could be long-winded and passionate. It's tiring to listen to them for that long. And they were thinking about setting up a time limit together. So like how long the other person can talk without the other person speaking. So I think if you approach that within that structure, so, when you talk for X amount of time, or when you raise your voice, I feel tired or I feel frustrated, because I value my time, or because I, even because of the MECFS, I just feel tired with, longer conversations. Would you be willing to talk for this long, or would you be willing to talk at this volume? That could be something that you could definitely have a conversation with them about. Someone was saying, how do you respond when people say, well, you just shouldn't feel that way when you try to express your needs? So again, I would just make sure that you're expressing your needs clearly, because our needs and our values, if we express them clearly, that can be less likely for people to have that pushback, because it makes sense, right? It's like fully making sense. And if someone says you shouldn't feel that way, again, that's about them. It's not about you. And it's really important to just understand that you're communicating, and how they receive it is not really your responsibility. It's just that you've communicated as well as you could. So as long as you're communicating well, that's great. So it's 4:28, so I'll just try to answer a few more of these questions. So do you have any suggestions for barriers to boundaries? Like if you have CFS and may need to set certain boundaries to protect your energy, but that may lead to an employer thinking about replacing you, or someone you're dating being dissatisfied in the relationship and leaving you for a more functional or healthy person. So I would really try to think about which boundaries you really need to increase your well-being. In a professional setting, there are protections, right? So there are disability rights and protections that make it so that there are accommodations that have to be made, and people can't fire you for that reason. Do people do that sometimes? Yeah, but it's illegal. So I would work with, an occupational therapist or your disability coordinator at work, and really make sure that those rights are being respected. In a relationship, I would just, see what kind of boundaries are actually like really important to you in terms of energy wise, and understand that, if somebody is in love with you, or they're, they really care about you, that needing to spend an hour with you doing outdoor activities only is not going to like matter to that person. So I think it's about finding the right person who's going to respect that. There are a lid for every pot. There are people who respect all sorts of different kinds of conditions. I have many clients with partners, and I have many clients who are, in a wheelchair, or who are disabled in many different ways. And a lot of them have loving partners that love them despite all of that stuff. So I think there are people out there who are going to be more understanding, and I think it's a matter of finding the people that are. All right, it's 4:30. So I'm sorry that there's a lot of questions I didn't get to. Occasionally, Dr. Arsenoa and I will do a question and answer period, which is literally just an hour and a half of me answering questions and him answering questions. So if there's the need for that, we will set one of those up in the next couple months. I really appreciate all of you, and I hope to see you in my courses and the hypnosis sessions, and to hear from you, and see you online. All right, take care, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. Enjoy the sunshine.